is that this House do now adjourn. The Honourable Member for Regina, Lewvan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In June, I asked whether the federal government would prioritize the use of Canadian-made steel in infrastructure projects such as the Trans Mountain expansion as well as the new Champlain Bridge in Montreal, particularly given the imposition of U.S. tariffs on Canadian steel exports. If we're unable to sell the steel south of the border, all the more reason to ensure that we're able to use it in federal infrastructure in our own country. Now, Mr. Speaker, this question is still very much relevant because, of course, we still have American tariffs on Canadian steel exports, even after this USMCA agreement to renew the former NAFTA. In addition to reiterating that question, I do want to raise some other issues regarding potential benefits for Canadian workers from federal infrastructure spending. The first thing I want to raise is to do with the Trans Mountain expansion. Kinder Morgan had contracted to do most of the construction with the Christian Labour Association of Canada, which is a very employer-friendly organization. It was recently kicked out of the International Trade Union Confederation, and I wonder if now that this is a public project, there might be consideration given to reissuing those contracts to more legitimate trade unions that would properly represent their employees and indeed bargain for better wages and working conditions. The second issue that I wanted to raise is that this government was elected on the promise of introducing a modernized fair wages policy after the former Conservative government had eliminated the federal fair wages legislation. And what this really means is that when the federal government builds infrastructure, the construction contracts should require some sort of minimum level of wages for different trades, which are better than the prevailing provincial minimum wage. So one way that the federal government could quite concretely ensure that its infrastructure investment benefits Canadian workers to a greater extent would be to keep its promise to reintroduce some sort of federal fair wages legislation. It's one of the first things I asked about at committee after I was elected, and we're still waiting for the government to make good on that promise. The third topic I'd like to raise would be the notion of community benefit agreements that the Government of Canada could attach to its infrastructure spending. This House passed Bill C-344, a private member's bill, to enable community benefit agreements. I believe, Mr. Speaker, that that bill is before the Senate, so it's not law yet. On the other hand, there really isn't anything stopping the federal government from making the choice to negotiate community benefit agreements when it gives out these infrastructure contracts. And I believe that would be another way that the federal government could ensure that its infrastructure investments are tied to local job and training opportunities, as well as other types of economic and social benefits for the regions where these infrastructure investments are occurring. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd be very interested to hear from the government whether they will take up any of these suggestions to ensure that their infrastructure spending makes the maximum possible contribution to our Canadian economy. Thanks again.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Infrastructure and Communities.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to begin by thanking the Honourable Member for Regina, Lewvan, for his question, and begin also by saying that Canada is a strong proponent of the rules-based international trading system, which ensures the predictability of global trade. And, Mr. Speaker, as you and all the members of this chamber will know, we will always defend Canadian workers and Canadian interests against protectionist actions, and nowhere was that more evident in our negotiations of the renegotiation of NAFTA, what is now called the USMCA, an important agreement in principle which we hope to have ratified in this chamber and in the other jurisdictions, the United States and our friend in Mexico. This agreement will preserve access for Canadian consumers to the largest economy, the largest market in the world. We have secured No tariffs on the auto sector. I know that's very important in the province of Ontario. We have ensured that we would preserve Chapter 19, which is an important dispute resolution mechanism for our countries. And finally, I would point out that we worked very hard to reduce duties at the border, which will ensure that Canadian consumers will have access to that market without having to pay as much duty as before. These are just some of the net benefits which are flowing from the USMCA. And I would also point out, in direct response to my friend's question, that at each and every critical juncture of this negotiation, we had brought to the table representatives from the labour community, representatives from Unifor, representatives from the Canadian Labour Congress, and we believe that having a strong labour community is intrinsically connected to ensuring that people are paid a fair wage. And he also pointed out, quite rightly, that we have enshrined, or in the midst of enshrining, a community benefits agreement framework, so that as proponents come forward with projects to strengthen our communities in the context of infrastructure, be it in transit, be it in terms of roads, be it in terms of cultural community centres, that there will be a direct benefit to the community as a result of the employment opportunities that are driven by the fruition of those projects. In the context of the question that my friend had asked previously, I would point out that Canada, one example of our commitment here in this region in Ontario, is the Canada-Michigan Crossing Agreement, which stipulates that only iron and steel that is produced in either the United States or Canada will be used in the construction of the Gordie Howe International Bridge.
Even in the cases of markets that are not subject to international trade agreements, we encourage the use of Canadian steel as part of public procurement through the policy on Canadian content and the policy on industrial and technological benefits.
The bridge in Montreal demonstrates our commitment to investing in safe, secure, and sustainable infrastructure that will meet the current and future needs of users. With an estimated $20 billion in Canada-United States trade and as many as 50 million vehicles flowing over the existing bridge every year, the Champlain Bridge corridor is crucial for both local commuters and businesses moving their goods back and forth across the border. Our priority is to deliver a safe, top-quality, toll-free new Champlain Bridge that is responsible and respectful towards the taxpayer. This federal infrastructure investment is ensuring a modern and sustainable crossing that will improve the quality of life of Canadians for the next 125 years by creating thousands of well-paying jobs that are helping to grow the middle class. To select
the private partner for this project, we followed a very strict procurement process, which is open, fair and transparent.
Canada's obligations under international trade agreements.
However, approximately 3/4 of the subcontractors and suppliers for this project are Canadian. That includes Can-Am, which builds the steel superstructure for the approaches to the new bridge.
Ensuring our projects are built safely, sustainably, and with the durability to last generations and protect the economic interests of all Canadians. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, member for Regina, Lewvan.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. The Parliamentary Secretary began his remarks by emphasizing the government's commitment to a rules-based trading system, and I certainly appreciate some of the positive accomplishments in the USMCA, but the fact remains that even with that deal negotiated, we still have American tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum exports. So the rules-based trading system isn't being respected, and I guess the question is, how will we respond to that? Will we just accept it, or will we use federal procurement policy to ensure that in the face of these trade barriers, that we can at least use Canadian steel in our own infrastructure? The Parliamentary Secretary talked a fair bit about the new Champlain Bridge in Montreal. The last time I asked about it, less than 20% of the steel for that project was being manufactured in Canada. So I think there are opportunities to use some of this steel that we can't sell south of the border in federal infrastructure right here in Canada. Thank you again.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, in direct response to my friend's comments about the ongoing steel and aluminum tariffs, the Prime Minister and the Minister for Global Affairs have been absolutely consistent and firm in our position. These tariffs are unacceptable. They're inconceivable. It is an absolute fallacy that Canadian steel could pose any kind of a national security threat to our friends in the United States, and we will continue to work with our friends south of the border to see that those tariffs are removed. And that will, of course, be very much connected to the USMCA as a means of creating opportunity, trade, commerce, wealth, which is driving records jobs growth under this government. Over 600,000 jobs created since we've taken the reins of this government, Mr. Speaker. Record low unemployment. We believe in good trade with our partners. We believe in having labour at the market, and that is why my friend and his constituents can be confident in the work that is being done on this side of the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.